Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Nun is discussing the status of the par, the cow, the ox brought by the Kohen Gadol as a carbon chatas for himself and for the other Kohanim on Yom Kippur. The Gemara has a couple of questions about how this par is categorized and what its halachas are. So the Gemara is in the middle of a machlokes as to whether or not you're allowed to use that cow if it's already slaughtered by a Kohen before you. Meaning, what happens is as follows. The Kohen Gadol is doing the avoda of this cow. He slaughters it, he collects the blood, and then he dies or becomes disqualified, and another Kohen has to come and take his place. The Kohen Gadol a second Kohen Gadol for the day, he has to step in and take his place. Does he have to do the entire par over again? Have to take a new par, slaughter it, and catch its blood to put on the mizbech? Or could he use this already started par and take the blood into the kodesh to put on the mizbech? So the Gemara brought a person opinion that says he's not allowed to use that. He has to bring a par. The Torah says he's allowed to come on Yom Kippur with a par, and he's not. A cup of blood does not count as a par. The other approach is that he is allowed to use it, and there are two Amaram hold that way as well. He is allowed to use it. Either cup of blood is called the par, or this is counted as if the avoda was done. So the Gemara is going to bring a couple of proofs, and that will take us into a discussion about another question about the par. Does this par count as a carbon sibor, a public carbon, or is a carbon yachid, a private carbon? And then the Gemara will discuss another question. If it's somebody were to do tamura, try to switch the kedusha off this cow, what would happen? So first of all, let's analyze the shaila of, is the blood of this cow called as if he's bringing the cow for kapara or not? So the Gemara says, we have a proof. The pasuk discussing a cow, not this particular cow, this is discussing the cow of a Kohen who did an Aveira because he paskined wrongly for himself. But what it says over there is after it's slaughtered, it says, V'haitzi es kol hapar. You should take the entire cow outside the camp, and it should be burned outside the camp. So you see that even though it's already slaughtered, it's called kol hapar. So you see that a slaughtered animal is still called a par. So too, you should say that this Kohen Gadol's par on Yom Kippur should still be called a par, even if it's slaughtered already. And by the replacement, bringing the blood of that par, he's fulfilling the qualification, he's fulfilling the obligation of bringing a par. It's still called bringing a par. So Gemara says, no, that pasuk didn't call it a par because a slaughtered cow is still called a par. The reason why it said that is because it's just coming to tell you that you have to bring the entire cow, the entire carcass of the cow altogether has to be brought outside and burned outside the camp. It says it's kol hakar, it's kol hapar, he has to bring the entire thing out. But it's not telling you that you could use the term par to refer to an already slaughtered cow. So Gemara says I have another proof, and that's from the par of the Kohen Gadol himself on Yom Kippur, because it says you should take that outside the camp and burn that as well. It says you should burn the par achatas and the soyer achatas. So you see it says that it's calling it a par, even though it's already slaughtered, so you see it is called a par. So Gemara now changes the question slightly. The Gemara says that the entire intact carcass of a slaughtered animal is still called that animal, that a slaughtered par is still called a par is not the question. The question is the blood called a par? Because he's not bringing the par anywhere. The Torah says bring a par. He's not bringing a par. He's just bringing the blood from the par. The par is already brought. Does that count as if he brings the par or not? So Gemara says, Rav Ashi says that it's logical to say that it does. Because the Torah says he should bring a par. What do you think it means when he brings the par? You think it means that he grabs the cow by its horns and drags it into the base of Mikdash? That's not what it means. It means that he takes its blood and he brings it onto the mizbech. So it's logical that when you bring the blood, that's called bringing the par. The other approach, which the Gemara says, at least Rav Ashi holds, is not logical, but the other approach is that when it says bring a par, it doesn't mean physically move it into the Beis HaMikdash. It means your way to be permitted to come into the Kodesh HaKodashim is if you have this par avoda. It's miskasher you. It makes you able to do it by bringing a par. It doesn't mean physically bringing it. Okay, now the Gemara says, let's leave that for a moment. Let's leave that machlokes for a moment. This whole machlokes was about, we were arguing, can you use the blood, does that count as a par? Now, there's a different problem here. The Kohen Gadol that got disqualified, what happened to him? We said, when we asked the question, we said that he died. So the original Kohen Gadol has died. That means that this cow was a carbon chatas, whose owner has died. The owner was paid for by the Kohen Gadol and is being brought to be mechaper on the Kohen Gadol. So it's a par that has an owner, which is a chata. It's a par chatas has an owner, and the owner has died. We know that the halacha is that there are 5 types of carbon chatas that have to be destroyed. They have to be left to die on their own. You cannot use them for a carbon. And one of them is where the owner died. So this is a classic example of a parachatas that's ruined. The owner died. So how can we consider that you could still bring the blood on the mizbech and not allowed to? The owner died. So Gemara answers that this is not a classic parachatas that halacha applies to. That halacha only applies to a par which is a carbon yachid, an individual carbon. This is called a carbon sibor. Even though it's brought by the Kohen Gadol, paid for by the Kohen Gadol, it's still called a carbon sibor because it works to bring kapara on all the kahanim, the entire shevet of kahuna are included. When he says vidui on this par, he says for all kohanim. So it's called a carbon sibor. So the Gemara says, are you so sure that it's called a carbon sibor? The Gemara says that Rava argues on that. Rava says it's not called a carbon sibor. Now the Gemara all the way at the end is going to say that Rava agrees that this answer is right. Because even though it's not called a carbon sibor, it's not called a public carbon, it's still called a carbon shutfin. It's called a partnership carbon because it works in partnership with all kohanim. Rava's issue was just you can't call it carbon tzibur. If you call it carbon tzibur, you're going to end up with a problem. That the Kohanim are going to think that they count as a tzibur. And there is a certain halachas which you require at tzibur, and the Kohanim are going to think that the shevet of Kohanim counts as a tzibur. And that's not true. The Kohanim are not a tzibur. The halacha, specifically that the Gemara refers to, is that if the majority of a shevet does a wrong halacha based on a psak that they got, then they have to bring special karbanas. The majority of Kohanim don't count for that halacha. So in order to make sure Kohanim don't feel like they're called a tzibur, they're called a shevet, we say no. This is not called a carbon tzibur, this is called a carbon shutrin. But that's all the way at the end of the Gemara. For now, the Gemara is, before we reach that conclusion, the Gemara is going to discuss this machlokes of is the par of the Kohen Gadol called a carbon tzibur or is it called a carbon yachid? And the Gemara will bring proofs back and forth. So let's analyze it. The Gemara so far says that Rava says that it's not called a carbon tzibur, but the Gemara calls Rav Amram says it is called a carbon tzibur. So now the Gemara says, let's analyze this based on a Mishnah that discusses what is the halacha of what types of karbanos can be brought on Shabbos and can be brought bitumah. So there's a Mishnah in Timur that says its rules as follows. If it's a carbon tzibur, it can be brought on Shabbos and it can be brought bitumah. If it's not a carbon tzibur, it cannot be brought on Shabbos and it cannot be brought bitumah. That was a Mishnah. In that Mishnah, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yaakov argue. And they both say it's not a correct rule. And I'm going to show you. And Rabbi Meir's argument says that I have examples of where you have something which is carbon yachid, and it still is Doiche Shabbos and Tumah. And one of his examples is a Par Yom Kippur. So you see that Rabbi Meir says that a Par Yom Kippur is a carbon yachid. Obviously, says Rav Amram, that means that the Rabbanan who are arguing say that it's the Par Yom Kippur is a carbon tzibur. So you see that the majority opinion, the Chachamim hold that the Par is a carbon tzibur. That's a proof that this Par is a carbon tzibur. So let's just see what Rav Meir's list was. He says that there are 3 situations where you have a carbon yachid, which is Doiche, Shabbos, and Tumah. Those 3 examples are a Par Yom Kippur, the Minchas Chavitin brought by the Kohen Gadol every day, and a carbon Pesach. So again, the proof is that if Rabbi Meir is asking that these are carbon yachid, the Chachamim who argue and say that a carbon yachid is never Doiche obviously hold that this is called a carbon tzibur, and that's why it is Doiche. Now, the Gemara says that this is a wrong understanding of this machlokes. This is not how this discussion went at all. What actually happened here was that they were arguing over whether the right rule, whether the way to define the rule, is that a carbon tzibur is Doiche Shabbos and Tumah, and a carbon yachid is not Doiche Shabbos and Tumah. And Rabbi Meir said it's an imprecise way of defining it. You're right. Most karbanos tzibur are doiche, most karbanos yachid are not doiche, but it's not because of carbon tzibur and carbon yachid. It's because there's a certain feature about most karbanos tzibur. Most karbanos tzibur have a fixed time, And most Karbanos Yachid do not have a fixed time. But that's really the issue. The issue is the fixed time and the not fixed time. And that's how you should define it. And my three examples are the three types of things which are a Karban Yachid that have a fixed time, and that's a Par Yom Kippur, a Chavitin, and a Karban Pesach. And the Chachamim agree to that halacha. The Chachamim just wanted to define the rule differently. They wanted to define it by Karban Tzibur, not by fixed time. But they agree that all these three examples are Karbanos Yachid. And therefore there's nobody here who holds that as a Karban Tzibur. And the Gemara says, I will prove to you that this is the Machlekes, because there's another list brought as a kash on the same Chachamim by Rabbi Yaakov, where he says, listen, Rabbi Meir attacked your way of defining the rule by showing you that there are Karbanos Yachid that are Daiche. I'm going to show you that there are Karbanos Tzibur that are not Daiche. Where do you see that? So he says that a par helim davar of a tzibur, where the majority of the tzibur made a mistake, that is one example of a karban tzibur which is not doiche. The sar and Yom Kippur is also not doiche, and a karban chagiga is not doiche. You can't do these things on Shabbos or B'Tumah. Now, don't tell me here that the same concept applies. That the Chachamim who argue on this obviously disagree with his way of defining Tzibur and Yachid, because Rabbi Yaakov's one of his examples was the par helam davar of a Tzibur, where Tzibur made a mistake. That's clearly a Karban Tzibur. There's no way of saying that, oh, the Rabbanan argue and they say, no, these three examples are not called Karbanos Tzibur, and that's why we say that they are, they're not Daiche. You can't. It's clear. One of his examples is clearly a Karban Tzibur. So obviously that's not what's going on here. What's going on is that Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Meir are bringing examples that don't fit in this rule, and therefore they're saying you have to redefine the rule. And the Chachamim don't argue on that. They define the rule differently, but they don't argue that these are the halacha, and therefore there is no opinion. Bottom line, what we see from here is that there is no opinion that holds that the Par Yom Kippur is really a Karban Tzibur. Okay, the Gemara now wants to bring a couple of more proofs. Now we want to prove that a par is called a Karban Tzibur. So the Gemara quotes Mishnah, brought by Abaye. The Mishnah says that there are a couple of types of Karbanos Chatas, that there's a Machlokes Tanaim, what happens if they get lost, and you bring a different one instead of them, and then you find the original one. That's called the Chatas Sheneskapru Ba'aleha. So the halacha is that a Chatas Sheneskapru Ba'aleha, generally, it is, you have to destroy that Chatas. It has to be left to die. So Gemara says, we have a Mishnah that says that a par and a soyer of Yom Kippur that were lost, and you found and you brought a replacement, and then you found the original. So the machlok is what happens to these. According to Rabbi Yehuda, they have to be left to die like any other chatas shenaskapru bala. According to Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Lazar, depending on the girsa, and Rabbi Shimon, this is different because these are karbanos tzibur, and therefore they don't have to be left to die. Instead, you could just leave them until they get a mum, and then you could bring them as a karban nidava in kaitza mizbech. So what we see from here is that the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon whether this cow has to be left to die or not. But nobody argues the fact that it is a karban tzibur. And one of the things on the list here was it said par and sar of Yom Kippur. So Gemara answers, then it says par here, it's not talking about a par of Yom Kippur. It's talking about a par and a sar of Yom Kippur. The par that we were referring to is a real par tzibur, not the par of Yom Kippur. So Gemara says, was a different version of the price that says clearly par of Yom Kippur and sar of Yom Kippur. So obviously we are talking about a sar of Yom Kippur. So here's the Gemara answers, and the Gemara says, no, it's not a karban tzibur, but we do agree that it is a karban shutfin. It's not a karban of the entire public, but it is a karban of partners, and the karban of partners has the same halacha, and therefore the answer that we said that it's not mesa, that applies here, and it works well. And even Rava agrees to that. He was just arguing because he didn't want Kahanim to consider themselves to be a tzibur. The Gemara now asks that 1 second there, we have a proof that there is an opinion that holds that the par of Yom Kippur is called a par tzibur, is called a karban tzibur. and we're now saying that it's not true. Rava at least is holding that it's a par shutvin, it's not a par tzibor. What's our proof now? So the Gemara says that it's a question that was asked by Rabbi Elazar whether a par of Yom Kippur could do Tumura. We'll get into this question more in a detailed coming up, but he asked if he could do Tumura. But the way he phrases the question is as follows: according to the opinion that the par of Yom Kippur is a carbon yachid, could it do Tumura or not? So the Gemara says that implies that there is an opinion that holds that it's not a carbon yachid. Obviously, that opinion holds that it's a carbon tzibor. So the Gemara says no, that opinion does not hold it's carbon tzibor. That opinion holds it's a carbon shutfin. Like we were saying all along, it's definitely a carbon shutfin, and it's not a carbon tzibor, at least according to Rava. Okay, now the Gemara gets more deeply into this discussion about whether the par of Yom Kippur could do Tumura or not, and that'll take us through the rest of the daf. Now, what's Tumura? Tumura means where you have an animal that's set aside as a carbon, and you try to transfer that Kedusha onto a different animal. So the halacha is that both animals now have Kedusha. The second animal gets Kedusha, and it's called a Tumura. And the original animal stays with the Kedusha that it had all along. And depending what type of carbon it is, you have varying halachas for the Tumura and for the original animal. So the Gemara says, so what's the question? The question is a par of Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, does that make Tumura on a second animal? If you try to transfer Kedusha to a second animal, is there Kedusha on that animal, or is it not Chal? Not every carbon can do this. Not every carbon, if you try to transfer its Kedusha onto a different animal, does that animal get Kedusha? For example, only a carbon Yachid could do that. A carbon Tzibor cannot do that. So the Gemara's question is, what about this par? Could it do that or not? Now, what's the issue? So the Gemara says the issue seems to be as follows. The par is bought by Aaron. It's bought by the Kohen Gadol. So it's paid for and it belongs to an individual, a Yachid. However, who is it mechaper for? Who does it work for? It works for all the Kahanim. If that's the case, it's kind of mixed up. It's confusing in between. On the one hand, it's a carbon Yachid and Tumur should work. On the other hand, it's a carbon Tzibor and Tumur should not work. So again, we're back to the issue of is it a carbon Yachid or a carbon Tzibor. In a sense, it's both. So Gemara says this shouldn't be a question at all. We know what the halacha is in a case where something is brought and paid for by one individual, and it is working for others or other. We know what the halacha is there. We know that the halacha is that we follow the miskaper, the person that it works for. As far as Tumur is concerned, it's considered to be belonging to the person or persons that it's working for, not the person and persons who brought it. And the Gemara brings a brisa that says that. The brisa says if somebody's makdish something for somebody else, he's makdish a carbon to work for somebody else, and then he wants to redeem it. So the halacha is that there's a few things. First of all, you have to add chomish, a fifth, if you're the owner. If the original owner wants to redeem it, you have to add a fifth. So as far as that halacha is concerned, the original owner here is the makdish, the one who made it hektish in the first place, because he's undoing his hektish, he counts as the original owner, and he has to add the fifth. If the person that he set it aside for on his behalf, if he wants to redeem it, he doesn't have to add a fifth. Now, as far as Tumura, who has the right to make Tumura? So only the miskapa has the right to make Tumura, the one that it's working for, not the one who is makdish it. Now, a similar halacha is somebody who separates truma from his own produce for his friend. He's using this truma to pater, to take off the obligation on his friend's produce. So the question is, who has the right to decide which kohen to give it to? And the halacha over there is that the person who's taking it off has the right to decide. But what we see from all these halachas is clearly the one who it's working for, that's the one who has the right to make Tumura, and therefore only the kohanim could make Tumura here, and since it's a carbon tzibor, since they are a tzibor, they cannot make Tumura, and therefore you should not be able to turn the par Kohen Gadol of Yom Kippur into Tumura. So Gemara says that was not the question. The question was, we know that it's the miskaper, the one that's working for, and the one who have any tumor rights, if there are any, should be the kohanim, the public, the tzibur of kohanim. The question is, we say it's working for them. Does that mean that it's like they're a real miskaper? It really works for them. The thing was set aside for them, and they get all the halachos of a carbon that was set aside for you? Or is it no? It's working for the Kohen Gadol. He bought it for himself. It's working for him. He's taking along the other Kohanim on his coattails. He's getting kapara, and he says, Hashem, be mechaper for me, and it's my carbon yachid, and spread my kapara on the other kahanim as well. But they're not really the owners. It wasn't set aside for them. It was set aside for the Kohen Gadol. He's just bringing kapara others as well. If that would be the case, then it would certainly be considered to be a carbon yachid of the original owner, who's the Kohen Gadol, and the other ones would not have any kapara, would not have any tamura rights in this thing. Now the Gemara tries to bring a proof that the par of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur could make Tamura, that if you try to switch his Kedusha to another animal, that other animal gets Kedusha. The proof is going to be from a Brisa which is somewhat complex, and the Gemara will try to establish that Brisa is talking about the par of the Kohen Gadol, and that really it's not. Now what does the Brisa do? The Brisa compares making Kedusha on an animal in the first place, the original Kedusha, which it calls a Zevach, and the Tamura. If you have a situation where an animal gets Kedusha through Tamura, the Gemara says that they have different halachos. There are stringencies that apply to the original animal that don't apply to a Tamura, and stringencies that apply to a Tamura that don't apply to an original animal. The Gemara's assumption as of this point is that all these stringencies, whatever we're referring to the same animal. When we say an original animal, we are referring to all the halachos that apply in one specific animal. One animal has all these halachos. And when we say Tamura, the halachas of a tamura, we're referring to one specific animal. So now, what is the halachas of a original animal? So the Gemara says an original animal could be a carbon tzibor or carbon yachid, and it could be an animal that pushes off Shabbos or Tumah. You could bring it on Shabbos or bring it Tumah, and it could have the extent of Kedusha that it could even make Tamura. You could transfer its Kedusha to something else. So this original animal that we're referring to, when you originally make an animal into a carbon, that original Kedusha has those three rules. However, when you apply Tamura Kedusha to an animal, those don't apply. It cannot be a carbon tzibor. A Tamura can never be a carbon tzibor. And it can never have a level of Kedusha that it pushes off Shabbos and Tumah. And that level of Kedusha can never be transferred to a third animal to make Tamura. So those three halachas apply only to original Kedusha and not to Tamura. Now, however, there are two stringencies that apply to Tamura Kedusha and not to original Kedusha. What's that? Tamura Kedusha could apply to a Balmum. You could make a Balmum into a Tamura. You cannot make an animal in its original Kedusha. You cannot apply original Kedusha to a Balmum. And the second halacha is that when you do apply Kedusha, and there's a mum, when you try to apply Kedusha to a Baal mum, generally the halacha is that for most animals it becomes chulin, and you can do whatever you want with it. However, when you apply Tamura Kedusha to a Baal mum, it still is forbidden to work it and to cut off its wool and use its wool. So these are two stringencies that a Tamura Kedusha has over a regular one. So now the Gemara says, this original carbon that we're referring to, the Zevach, what type of carbon is it? You told me that it's a carbon, you said that it could push off Shabbos and Tumah. That's only a carbon, Tzibor could do that. A carbon Yachid cannot do that. And then you told me that it can make Tamura, but only a carbon Yachid can make Tamura. A carbon tzibur cannot make Tamura. So what are you talking about? So it says you have to be talking about the power of the Kohen Gadol. Power of the Kohen Gadol could be brought on Shabbos and B'tumah, because it has a fixed time. Like we said earlier, this is one of the exceptions. And it obviously then it could make Tamura, because that was our question. Could it make Tamura now? We see from here that it could make Tamura. So here's our proof that it could make Tamura. So Gemara says, no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about something else. We're talking about the ayil of Yom Kippur. The ayil is a carbon oila that's brought by iron on Yom Kippur, and that there's no question that it could make Tamura, and that there's no question that it could push off Shabbos and Tumah. So Gemara says, and I'm actually going to prove to you we're talking about the ayil, because we're talking about the chatas, then something doesn't make sense over here. The par was a chatas, right? What's the halacha of the Tamura of a chatas? Tamura of a chatas is mesa. You have to leave it to die. Cannot be brought as a carbon ever. However, here when we're discussing Tamura, we said that the Tamura doesn't have the halacha that it pushes off Shabbos and a Tumah. That means you can't bring it on Shabbos and Tumah, but you could bring it during the week then. But if we're talking about a Tamura of a carbon chatas, you can't bring that during the week. That has to be left to be mesa. Obviously, we're not talking about the par. We're talking about the ayil, which is an oila. And therefore, you could bring it during the week. So Gemara wants to push off this argument. Gemara wants to say, no, not necessarily. Maybe we're talking about Tamura, we're not referring to a specific animal. We're not saying all the halachas of a specific animal. We're talking about Tamura, we're talking about the general halachas of Tamura out there. The Gemara says, very funny. If you're saying that, you're talking about general halachas of Tmuras, so then when you're talking about original Kedushas, you're also talking about general halachas of original Kedushas. So what was your proof in the first place that we have to be talking about a par, or we're talking about an ayo? We're talking about anything we want. We're talking about general halachas. Some Kedushas are carbon yachid, some Kedushas are carbon tzibur, some posher Shabbos, some posher tumah, some make Tmura. Doesn't have to all apply to the same thing. You don't have to find one animal which has both, could be a carbon tzibur, and makes Tmura, and it pushes off Shabbos. I don't have to find such a thing. The Gemara says, no, that's not correct. When we said zevach, the original Kedusha, we're referring to one specific animal. We're not talking about the general halachas. And the way you know that is because one of the things that we said about a zevach is that it doesn't apply to a balmum. Original Kedusha doesn't apply to a balmum, but there are some original Kedushas that do go on a balmum. You know what that is? A Bukhar and a Meiser. Bukhar and a Meiser can get Kedusha even if they're a balmum. So obviously then we're not talking about all the general halachas of zevach. We're talking about one specific animal that is not a Bukhar, not a Meiser, and therefore it cannot get Kedusha on a balmum, but it has these halachas. And my question was, what animal are we referring to? There's no such animal that is both makes Tmur and preserves Shabbos, and therefore I said it has to be a chatas. You want to say it's an ayil? Fine, I hear it. But that is why when we talked about a zevach, we had to be talking about one animal. However, we're talking about Tmur, we could be referring to general animals and not one specific animal and Kedusha that it is.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.